Hello, people. I am here behind the camera. This is the seminar on at 1 o'clock on. I should be doing it this actually. Yes. Okay. This is the seminar at 1 o'clock on the 1st of October 2024, and we're very pleased to have a presentation by Téa Hume about the 1933 Czech film Dog's Life, Život je pes. Over to you, Téa.
Thank you. So my presentation is going to be on the film Life is Hard and what it tells us about interwar Czechoslovak society. So the aspects of interwar Czechoslovak society that I hope to discuss are unemployment in Czechoslovakia and how Victor's unemployment issues, while farcical, were still relatable to wider society. I'll also talk about the perception of women and hopefully answer the question, do female characters realistically represent the position of women at the time? Then I'll talk about the bustling metropolis of Prague and how the backdrop of Prague displays class differences and diversity. And then at the end I'll do a quick note on Western influence in the film. So, just to give a wee bit of background on the employment situation in 1930 Czechoslovakia, prior to the movie being released in 1933, Wall Street crashed in 1929. This had disastrous effects across the world, and each country seen an average decrease in their GDP by about 10%. This also had similarly disastrous impacts in Czechoslovakia. For example, unemployment reached an all-time high in the first 4 months of 1933, and Thomas Lysenek states that in February 1933 there were 920,182 Czechoslovaks in need of a job, but actually only 7,285 vacancies to fill. Lysenek also states that during this period of high unemployment, suicide rates were 2.5 higher than what they are today. So, how does the film use unemployment to influence the narrative? Well, in the film, we witness Victor being fired from his job in a tailor's and his subsequent rejections from other potential jobs. As a result of these rejections, he attempts suicide by gassing himself, but the viewers are able to witness that this is unsuccessful because his gas bill is actually cut due to not being paid. Comedy is then utilised when Victor wakes up, he checks his pulse, he's very dramatic and shocked to realise he's still alive. He's essentially just had an hour-long nap. So he prepares to attempt suicide again, this time by hanging himself with his bell. However, he stops after seeing rye, pigs and chimney sweeps out of his window, which are all symbolic of luck, and he states that he'd be silly to kill himself if he's surrounded by such luck. Comedy is once again brought in to lessen the heavy topic of suicide, as Victor's ditzy and clumsy nature results in him attempting to tie his belt around his neck, not his tie. And finally, the main plot of the movie is, of course, the double identity formed by Victor to maintain his employment. So, does this truly reflect interwar Czechoslovak society? Well, as mentioned by Lysenek, unemployment and suicide rates were at an all-time high during 1933 interwar Czechoslovakia. Therefore, Victor's attempted suicides due to unemployment, though farcical, may still have been a realistic representation of the extremes that people would be pushed to from unemployment, poverty and financial hardship. The comedic effect of Victor's attempted suicide could also be a form of dark humour, possibly being used to make light of the dire employment situation. In addition, Victor was discriminated against for his age. He was too old to be a bag maker, but too young to be a copy editor. He was not popular enough to have his music published, but he also wasn't talented enough as a pianist. All the odds were working against him, and this could possibly be displaying how restrictive and oversaturated the job market was. So while this may be an extreme case, as Victor did forge a whole other identity, the rejections he faced were still likely relatable to local audiences because there was only one vacancy for every 126 people seeking employment. I'm just going to move on now to talk about how women were perceived in interwar Czechoslovak society. So Stanislav Holubek states that in interwar Czechoslovakia, working class women went straight into the workforce after leaving school. That was their most likely route. Whereas for middle class women, they had the choice to either continue their education help around the house, or become a cleric, whereas working class women were usually working in factories. Hollybeck also states that after marriage, working class women would continue to work, while middle class women would leave employment to take care of their husbands. So it could go either way, that working class women did have the freedom to maintain work and earn their own living, but it also could mean if they were married and working class, they may not have even been able to survive off of one wage from their husband, unlike the middle class. In addition, women could expect to spend up to 7 to 10 years out of work to care for their children until they reached skilling age. Therefore, there was still an expectation in some parts of interwar Czechoslovak society that women would be sole caregivers of the family, whether it was to care for their husband or children. However, while it is evident that a portion of people continued to view women as caregivers and maternally orientated, they were beginning to gain more autonomy and freedom in their lives. Women of the working class are noted to have been engaged in dating culture, premarital sex, and living with the opposite sex. In addition, contraceptives are said to have been used by the Czechoslovak middle class in the early 1920s, and this was then introduced and popularised in the 1930s among the working class through a communist women's magazine. The introduction of contraception would allow more sexual freedom and control over their employment, as Hollybeck states that factories offered jobs mostly to childless working class women. So, is Eva representative of women in interwar Czechoslovakia? Well, Eva is evidently middle class. Her father is the owner of music publishers. She works as a clerk for him, and her sister Helen is pursuing her studies in music. I would argue that Eva as a whole isn't representative of women in interwar Czechoslovak society, but that she displays behaviours seen in middle class and working class women of the time that they would both maybe be able to relate to. Eva owns a car, and she's quick to put on a mechanic's uniform and attempt to fix it. Even with Victor present, she fully intends to solve the issue herself, showing that she's strong-minded and independent. However, very few women would actually relate to owning a car. It's quite a luxury and far too costly for working-class women. However, as the centre of Prague did house a lot of middle-class people, it might not seem too far-fetched for a middle-class woman to have such an asset. Eva is seen to spend time alone with Victor. They act affectionately towards each other and even kiss on a few occasions. This appears to break middle-class tradition because there was an expectation, even in 1930, for middle-class women to remain virgins until marriage, so it may have been perceived as scandal for Eva to be alone with Victor and for them to both be so flirtatious with one another. Such sexual freedom seems to be more attributed to the working class. Ultimately though, this was a period marked with change. Society was evolving, and although Eva isn't representative of a large portion of interwar Czechoslovak society, she could have been somewhat of an inspiration. She was strong-minded, independent, she had a car and she had a job, so she could have represented an ideal of an independent, autonomous woman. So how do other female characters compare to reality? Well, Hollybeck states that married women above the age of 25 were seen as old maids, thus showing that there still remained a large societal pressure to marry. This is represented in the movie through the mother and daughter characters at the wedding. The mother cannot marry her daughter off and is frustrated, possibly due to potential financial burden of her remaining under her parents' care. Therefore, this is a realistic representation of how some women were viewed in interwar Czechoslovakia, but certainly not representative of everyone. And how does the background of Prague display societal diversity in interwar Czechoslovakia? Well, the backdrop of Prague is frequently used throughout the film. On-site filming displays the bustling metropolis, and you can say that methods of transport serve to highlight societal differences. Eva represents the middle class and she drives, whereas Victor, who represents the working class, relies on public transportation from the trams. Furthermore, the architecture of Prague serves to represent cultural and societal differences. Victor lives in a scrawny one-bedroom flat that he struggles to pay rent for, while Eva has a luxurious and spacious home that features modern decoration. The differences in societal diversity is backed up by Hollybeck, who states that 40% of the workers stayed in Prague, and the rest of the city was made up of middle-class inhabitants. So it's almost a 50-50 split. Therefore, the movie does accurately represent the diversity of Prague. And a quick note on Western influence. So, the character of Eva shows striking resemblance to Jean Harlow in 1933 as she became a film sensation. However, such similarities like blonde hair, red lips and thin arch brows shouldn't be solely attributed to Western influence, as this discredits the wide array of Czechoslovak actresses whom the character Eva may have been modelled on. It's been noted that an article from the period found that blonde hair in Czechoslovak movies was kind of just norm and not exotic. This is further backed up by journalist Kate Carless, who states that blonde hair in Czechoslovak film wasn't that unusual. It might have been an Italian film, but in Czechoslovakia, brunettes represented the unusual. Therefore, it's likely that Western influence therefore, it's likely that there was little Western influence over the character design of Eva, and the potential Czechoslovak influence may include Vera Ferisova, who, if we look at just the position of her hair and the angle, it looks very similar to Eva's character on the promotional poster of Adult Life. So, to summarise, interwar Czechoslovakia was a time of change, hardship, but also advancement. While Life is Hard is a comedy, it does manage to shine a light on the employment crisis and likely provided comedic relief for local audiences at the time. In addition, women began to gain new independencies after World War I, and this is evident in the character of Eva. She has her own job, she has a car, she follows her own path in life, it seems. But women also, on the flip side, were sometimes still perceived as marriage pawns who were on a tight timescale to marry before they were seen as undesirable. Finally, the backdrop of Prague displays a diverse city and how the working class and middle class coexisted, potentially showing how barriers between classes were soon to be broken, particularly with marriage between different classes, which we see with Victor and Eva. That's me.
Well, brilliant. Yeah. This is, ladies and gentlemen, what presentations should look like. So we've started with a bang. History rules again, supreme. I mean, absolutely brilliant idea, this thing of taking these little pointers that are in the film and looking for factual information within sort of academic literature, and you've done it very well, and you've actually discovered quite a lot of very interesting things. Thank you very much. I will just add this thing about the class differences about public transport. Just thinking, as you've been talking, I've just been considering that it's an upper middle class family, really. The Eva's family and the publishing house, obviously they're behaving quite kind of informally, but nevertheless you can see that it's really quite an exception. The level of affluence is really quite high, and I am just wondering whether this is a kind of stroke for the people within the unemployment period, so that they look that you are allowed into the sort of society of really rich people, and you can kind of for 2 hours within the cinema enjoy kind of their existence. And you can also, because they are presented quite informally, you can also kind of see that they are not ogres, right? So this is interesting. The other point, as I'm saying, about those cars and about those trams, in that film there are quite a lot of those cars, and kind of I'm just wondering whether it slightly maybe exaggerates this kind of hubbub of a sort of metropolitan city. I'm just wondering how many cars there really would have been in 1933. It is true that actually Czechoslovakia or the Czech lands in Austria-Hungary were really advanced with introducing cars. You wouldn't know that the first ever driving licenses in the world were published were issued in the city of Liberec in the north of what is now the Czech Republic in 1890. So actually there were so many kind of allegedly cars in 1890 in the Czech lands that some office decided that it was necessary to start issuing driving licenses. So yes, cars were probably more common quite early, than in many other places, but nevertheless I still feel kind of whether it is not a little bit too excessive. Yes, of course, you see that, you show that picture of Wenceslas Square, which is the absolute city center, commercial city center, something like Oxford Street in London or whatever, which incidentally Sadiq Khan wants to make pedestrian, as you may have heard. Maybe all right, but the difference, most people would have been going by trams, I think. And also I remember my childhood in which was under communism, of course, in the kind of 50s, 60s, and we lived in absolute center of Prague because the communist regime sort of housed young families without a property in sort of empty flats. And I remember how we kind of played in those streets, and they were absolutely empty of cars. And now when you go there, it's totally chock-a-block with idiots who park everywhere, even on pavements, right? So, so yes, I think that those cars were quite slow. Anyway, enough of my rant. Do you have any questions? Or comments?
I thought it was really good.
Thank you.
Like I think you said it well. It was like you had the points from the film, and then like a source for like that was so exact, and I liked the bit about the hair color and the comparison to American cinema, which would have been huge in the 30s, and then suddenly being like, oh, it wasn't. It was so much more Czech than it was influenced by the West.
Thank you.
Well, that thing about that hair color was really interesting, wasn't it? I mean, yes, and I mean the fact that you found those articles, that's brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much. 17 minutes, it says here. That's that's okay. Thank you very much, and let's go a little bit further. Fair exchange is no robbery. Don't close it. I'll use that.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to say
The
it?
thing is still submission status is what? Oh, right. If you go back to just to the my courses. Oh, will it open? Yeah, they just opened that. No. I suppose just this. Okay, thank you very much. So that I can actually. Okay, thank you very much. I'll go on a little bit. Thank you. Great stuff. Still recording. Want to use a little bit of our time here to anticipate tomorrow's film, which is again a Hugo Haas film. It's called The White Disease, and it was made only 4 years later than this. And when you actually see it tomorrow, you will be totally stunned. What a difference! Now, of course, in 1933, Hitler only got to power, so that they didn't necessarily need to know yet what this was going to mean. And of course, the film would have been concerned with local indigenous problems like, as we discussed it, unemployment, maybe the position of women and what have you, and the sort of industrialization of technological progress. We often forget that, I mean, our age is incredibly sort of full of technological progress, but sort of the 1920s was absolutely technologically, it was stunning for people who had to cope up well with the arrival of sound film, radio, I don't know, telegraph and whatever, everything. So, so yes, they were very much aware of that. Now, however, within 4 years of the Nazi regime in Germany, this really became quite a menace. And as you know, I mentioned it before, and you would have seen that ITV film about the interwar history of Czechoslovakia. Just a year later, in 1938, really Hitler's Germany, with the help of Britain and France, destroyed Czechoslovakia. And in fact, that there was another anniversary. Usually it falls on just right around that time that we talk about it in this class. The Munich Agreement was concluded between Nazi Germany and France and Britain without Czechoslovakia on the 30th of September 1938. So the anniversary was yesterday. And if I may kind of mention, I was looking at Twitter of the Czech Foreign Office, and they of course went on about it again, and I don't like it because it kind of encourages this favorite Czech feeling of victimhood. Oh, we are such incredible victims, and we are so small as a nation, and the world does all these nasty things to us. I want to mention, I think I mentioned it to one of you, if you read that book that I would very much recommend as a kind of primary historical source about the 20th century history of Czechoslovakia, is that book by Mary Hyman. She used to teach at Strathclyde. She's now in Cardiff. Czechoslovakia, the state that failed. She was later admitting that maybe it was a stupid title because it shouldn't have been so negative. It is true that it's a state that failed because in 1993 it divided itself between the Czech Republic and Slovakia quite peacefully. But of course it also failed in 1938 because of the Munich Agreement. So anyway, she has this interesting, the book is slightly subversive, probably Czechs wouldn't like it so much. She points out that the founder of Czechoslovakia, that sociologist, professor of sociology, President Liberator Thomas Masaryk, born 1850, died 1938, 1937 maybe, actually. He kind of spoiled his chances with the West, or maybe Britain, she says, because you know that at the age of 64 in 1914 he left the Czech lands and went around canvassing, tried to persuade Western politicians to allow the disintegration of Austria-Hungary and the creation of those independent states. And of course, when it was agreed by the Western Allies in the summer of 1918 that independent Czechoslovakia should be created, the Britons, and I suppose the French as well, were kind of worried what would happen with the German minority, right? Because they had some kind of inkling that not only Czechs lived on the territory of the Kingdom of Bohemia, that there was also a German-speaking minority. But of course it was a totally different era. Nobody traveled anywhere, and of course Western politicians had very little information about what was going, especially in Britain, outside the British Empire and in the non-English speaking countries. And Masaryk was an arrogant bastard, if I may say so, and he basically assumed, probably correctly, that those Western politicians know absolutely nothing about Central Europe. So when they said, but there are all those Germans, and what will happen with them, and how many of them are there? And he basically lied and said there are some tens of thousands. It doesn't really matter. And of course they didn't know any better, so they approved the creation of independent Czechoslovakia. But Lloyd George later found out that Masaryk lied to him, and that out of the 15 million or whatever Czechoslovaks, 3 million were Germans, right? Not some tens of thousands. So that probably, that's an interesting kind of sort of lesson for you historians. Don't do anything bad, because you may never know what negative repercussions it may have decades later. And Heimat in that book argues that, of course, this created bad blood in Britain towards the new Czechoslovakia, and that actually British politicians kind of instinctually sort of knew this, and so this may have contributed to the betrayal of Czechoslovakia in 1938 during that Munich Agreement. So this is just a slight sort of correction of this victimhood thing which the Czech foreign ministry is putting out, or put out yesterday on the day of the anniversary. I should have written this under it, but I didn't think about it at the time, and now this could probably gone. Anyway, 1937, Karel Čapek. Karel Čapek was one of the most well-known Czech authors in the interwar period. He was very close to President Masaryk. In fact, what they had, very idealized times. They had this group called Pátečníci, the Friday people. Basically, President Masaryk on Friday afternoon would knock off at the end of his shift. Prague Castle is on a hill. He would walk down to the river and up to Wenceslas Square. It's a walk of half an hour. No security. And there he would meet people in a pub with whom they discussed various things, or in Čapek's flat, which was in Vinohrady, just on the other side of the hill. So he was often quite accused, Karel Čapek, that he was too close maybe to the president. Karel Čapek was primarily a journalist. It's quite interesting that historically, great Czech authors, there was another one called Karel Havlíček-Borovský in 1848, who was primarily a journalist. That writers sort of got their experience in newspapers, and he was associated with a newspaper called Lidové noviny, the People's Newspaper, whatever, which was a kind of Czech, the Times at the time, and that of course ended up didn't survive communism. It was resurrected after the fall of communism, and quite interestingly, its owners last month closed it down. So it's after kind of whatever, maybe 100 years existence, they decided that, well, anyway, newspapers in any country are really under real pressure of the internet. I think some stuff is still published on the web, but it doesn't come out in a printed form. But anyway, so Karel Čapek, born 1890, died 1938. He died at Christmas 1938, just about 3 months before Czechoslovakia was properly occupied by Nazi Germany. I just repeat, during that Munich agreement, the British and the French forced Czechoslovakia to give up those frontier regions which were inhabited by the German speakers, which was a real problem because the Czechs were not idle during the 30s, and when Hitler obviously got to power, they built on the French example. The French had this Maginot Line, defense line against Nazi Germany. So the Czechs did absolutely brilliant kind of fortification with tunnels or whatever. You can see them there to this very day. But of course, as a result of Munich, all that was given to the Germans, so that basically the rest of Czechoslovakia became defenseless. And as you know from that film, then Hitler threatened the new president, the head of the state bank, Haas, that Prague would be bombed if he didn't allow the occupation of the whole of Czechoslovakia on the 15th of March 1939. This was actually a very depressing time in a way, because the war hadn't started. The war started, as you know, on the 1st of September 1939, when actually Hitler attacked Poland. And so the West said, well, obviously, right, unfortunately, we have to go into war now. United States, of course, it took some time to join the war, but even so. So anyway, had Čapek not died at Christmas 38, what actually happened, he had this country residence about 20 miles outside Prague, and there was some kind of flood before Christmas in 39, and he was trying to stem the flood, the brook on his land or whatever, and got soaked and got pneumonia, and there was no antibiotics. Penicillin was not invented until 1945, so he basically died. But also it's quite interesting because he was a representative of democracy. He was really subject to quite a lot of extreme right-wing attacks in the autumn of 38. So it could be said that he kind of died of broken heart also. So, at the beginning of the First World War, 1914, Čapek would have been 24, and under normal circumstances he would have been drafted into the war and could have been killed. However, he had some kind of spinal disease, so he actually avoided the draft. Nevertheless, he was absolutely horrified by the First World War and by this thing which many people felt. You prior to that you had normal civilized kind of world. There's a reference on Moodle to these BBC programs where one former conservative politician, I forget his name now, just basically looked at all the kind of hotel adverts and the timetables, train timetables existing in, say, about 1910, and tried to recreate sort of some kind of tourist journey from about 1910. It's interesting how, Bowler had its civilization, everything was totally civilized. And then Čapek realized, or many people realized, everything totally collapsed into absolutely mad mayhem of killing of the First World War, because there hadn't been a war for quite a long time, some decades, and there was technological progress. And what you actually had, you drafted all these young Frenchmen to the trenches in Belgium, and the Germans had their machine guns. And what actually happened, these Frenchmen would arise from those trenches and the Germans would go ta-ta-ta-ta like that and kill. The war started in the summer of 1914, and by about the autumn, tens of thousands of people being killed by this stupidity. So anyway, so Čapek was incredibly influenced by all this. Warning against the ideological mind, I would say. Now, I put this in here, of course, at the time of the pandemic, and I would say Čapek was an incredibly good psychological kind of sensitive psychological analyst, right? And that's why he was able to put in things which it makes him feel like a prophet, right? So this play takes, I wrote this during COVID, imagine this, takes place at a time when extreme right-wing populism is starting to influence many countries of Europe, and at the same time Europe is suffering from a pandemic which has come from China. He wrote this in the 1930s, right? And one other thing, the pandemic kills people over 50 years of age. Right, so it's kind of very uncannily similar in connection with what we experienced with COVID. Anyway, and of course, right-wing populism. And when you see the beginning of the film and the dictator played by Zdeněk Štěpánek, you can think of Donald Trump or actually Putin, who says also we need now our special territory and whatever. Čapek was a Democrat from the very beginning. Earlier in his writing, he also used, incidentally, quite a lot of sci-fi stuff, which he put his ideas across using sci-fi. For instance, there's this interesting book called The Absolute at Large, which he basically said himself was rubbish because he wrote it in installments for the newspaper. It was published in the newspaper. And what this is about is that a carburetor, anticipating nuclear energy, a carburetor is invented which produces unlimited energy, right? So that you have a small carburetor and you sit it on, it actually uses normal any metal, and it just decomposes it and produces unlimited energy, so that actually a small carburetor can provide energy for the whole sort of city of 1 million people, right? However, because this carburetor breaks down matter, and I don't know whether some of you may have known something about pantheism. Pantheism teaches that there is God in all things, right? And this is what's problematic about that carburetor, because when it sort of breaks down matter into nothing, into energy, there's a byproduct, God, right? And of course, because it is a fantastic invention, capitalism, of course, immediately seizes it, and everybody installs carburetors, and it's wonderful, and everything, everything, there's free energy and all that. The problem is that each carburetor produces a religious fanaticism. And so basically what happens, everything collapses into absolutely sort of multifaceted wars, because every supporter of every carburetor hates the religion of the people of the other carburetors. So this is just one example, right? He was very tolerant to begin with, emphasizing that everybody should have the right to their own opinion, whatever it is, and we should respect it. Later on, when obviously Czechoslovakia was threatened by Nazi Germany, he wrote stuff which is much more in defense of democracy. And as I was saying, that first it was a play performed by the Czech National Theatre, and its premiere had this half an hour standing ovation because people saw it as an anti-fascist play. But it's up to you after you see it tomorrow whether you really think it's anti-fascist or whether Čapek was a little bit more complicated author. Now, briefly, we still have a little time. Does this work? This is maybe far too detailed for this course, but nevertheless, this was what he looked like. Slideshow. Okay. Now there was a Czech studies professor who's dead. He's dead now. Robert Vincent was his name. In London, at London University. This is gossip, and he was incredibly contrary, right? Which is probably good, because he was, however, also a very good researcher and produced quite a lot of very interesting stuff you may come across when dealing with Czech topics. But nevertheless, I had my predecessor here in Czech studies, Dr. Igor Hayek, who however died decades ago, was saying it would be great if there were 10 professors of Czech literature in Britain and one of them was a maverick. That would be fine, but if you have only one and he's totally mad, that's a bit of a problem. That's what he said, but I don't think that he was totally mad. But he actually has had quite a lot of he's produced quite a lot of specialists, British specialists in Czech matters, and they really loved him. And I think they hate me for pointing out that some of his views were maybe slightly unusual. So anyway, Čapek was an idiot, according to Vincent. He didn't really understand the nature of evil, was unoriginal, pedantic, was an optimist, was out of touch with reality, instinctively was an anti-Semite, and was an anti-intellectual. So that was his criticism, which I started with this. This really, PowerPoint is connected to, is a reaction to one of Vincent's reviews of Čapek. His formative years were Austro-Hungarian Empire, had traumatic experience of First World War. He analyzes political relations under imperialism, which is topical again today. When I studied Čapek under communism, the world was bipolar, right? I mean, is it becoming again like that these days a little bit more? But you had the Soviet Empire and then you had the West, right? So what Čapek wrote about didn't kind of really seem to fit that kind of situation. But these days we have more, or certainly until recently, we had sort of more centers of power competing with each other. So that's basically the age of imperialism that Čapek writes about. Now, of course, as I'm mentioning this, it is changing, isn't it? You've got Russia on the one hand, China on the second hand, and then you have the failing United States. So it's just a 3-point situation. For Čapek, civilization is always on the brink of destruction. This is the impact of the First World War trauma. We don't really need to go into these details. Utopias, I should probably mention that just for one thing, that he is the person who invented the word robot, right? Rossum's Universal Robots, Mr. Rossum, which is a kind of variation of the word intellect. Mr. Rossum had a firm and they made these humanoids, right? And this is a play about humanoids, and it was played on Broadway in the 1920s. And of course, as a result of that, the word became internationally well known. How did he invent it? His brother, painter Josef Čapek, was asked by him, look, I'm writing this play, what should a artificial humanoid be called? And he said, well, there's this Czech word, robota, which means hard work, chore. Why don't you turn a chore man or woman would be a robot, wouldn't it? So that's how it came to pass. So that's what he invented. Don't need to go into these details. This is this thing that I told you about, the absolute at large. The white disease. The disease can be seen as a moral affliction. The book cannot be construed as propaganda for peace. There are elements of existentialism, fear of death, anticipating the Czech dissident and later the first post-communist Czech president Václav Havel, who kind of argued everyone is part of the system, even the dissidents. This was an interesting idea. This basically, Czech Republic is kind of now overrun by anti-communism, and everybody kind of again was a victim to something which was imposed on the country from the outside world, which is rubbish. Havel was too bright to actually acknowledge this, and he basically said even if you fought against the communist system as a dissident, you were still a part of it, because you were a part of the whole society. You had to buy communist milk, you had to buy communist bread, right? So anyway, and it is interesting idea because there's an anticipation of this in this play. To sum up, Čapek's writing is rooted in Austria-Hungary, but he was a keen observer, has described a number of mechanisms still at play today. His writing conveys an acute feeling of the precariousness of the human condition. It displays influences of Freud and existentialism, and it anticipates postmodernism. Okay? And 1350. Now this is an anticipation of a film which you will, I think, enjoy. It's a great film. It's interesting how quickly they made it. I mean, he wrote the play in 1937. Huho Haas, that actor, directed it, actually wrote the script, directed it, and in 37, of course, in 38, it was all over. But one interesting thing which I always say, these dictatorships, they never destroy anything, right? Now, you have in America, you have kind of, if you look at American film history, there are absolute lacunae, kind of missing bits, because I mean, it was, these films would have been made by private companies, these companies would go bust, they wouldn't have money to pay for the archives, so those films were destroyed. So there are lots of kind of silent films from the 20s, early 30s that are no longer available, because this is how they disappeared, because it was based on private kind of enterprise. While Nazism just banned these things and put them into archives which they paid for. Communism, the same thing, right? So the film, I mean, the film was made in a place, Jewish film even, right? Hugo Haas, Jewish film director. But they didn't destroy it. It just went into the archive. Similarly, there were lots of films made in communist Czechoslovakia in the liberal 60s, and then after the Soviet invasion, they were banned for 20 years. But again, the communist decision didn't destroy them. So they just put them into the archives, and the archives were state-owned, so they were paid for it. Interesting. Anyway, any comment, questions? Yes?
Why not just destroy the films?
Why they didn't destroy? I don't know. But I don't know. A speculation. Maybe it's some kind, a little bit of paranoia in it, because you need to know what your enemies thought. So you have to maybe I don't know. You have to have it. Obviously, it's not accessible to anyone, but our specialist kind of analysts. So we have to have all this in some kind of. It could have been during the Nazi occupation. It could have been that actually there was a barrier formed by the Czechs, right? That the Germans maybe didn't necessarily know everything that was in the archives. But nevertheless, in communism, this wasn't the case because everybody was indigenous, so that doesn't work there. But it's true that the Gestapo was looking for Čapek. When they occupied Czechoslovakia in March '39, they were looking for Čapek. They didn't know that he died, so they would have immediately put him into a concentration camp. And that brother of his, Josef Čapek, the painter, ended up in a concentration camp and actually died 2 weeks before the end of the Second World War in a concentration camp in April 1945. So horrors, as usual, basically, yes. Anything else? Well, let's call it a day. What's the time? 13:53, that's probably all right. I'll dash to the other place again. Unfortunately, I have a bike. Thank you for your attention. I'll put this up for other people. Has it recorded?